Everything happened so quickly, it's hard to recount every detail, but I'll try my best. Last week, my girlfriend Anne and I had made plans to visit her parents. They live a few hours away, on the other end of the state. We usually don't get out very often. Anne and I spend the majority of our time working. We are both quite passionate about our careers, and as a result, rarely find the time for friends and family. We've missed quite a few holidays and get-togethers over the years. This past week, on a random coincidence, our days off happened to perfectly align for us to have 3 days off together. We could have always taken time off from work for holidays and such, but we wanted to save our days for a special occasion, and for emergencies. So it came as a welcome surprise when we both noticed the alignment. Anne immediately suggested that we visit her parents during the time off, while I suggested we just stay in for the week and relax. Guess who won that debate? After it was decided, Anne spent the day chatting with her mother on the phone about the visit, and to say she was thrilled would be an understatement. We spent the night before packing a couple overnight bags for the few days. I had finished packing my bag by around 7 p.m., and Anne didn't finish packing until 7 a.m. Not to say she stayed up all night packing, she's just very indecisive on a lot of things, and ended up repacking her bag in the morning. After she was finished, I loaded up the car and we began our 3-hour car ride. The first hour of the journey was quite uneventful. We had to pass through our own city and get on the highway that cut through the rural part of the state. Once we had made it onto the highway, it was supposed to be smooth sailing, but that ended up not being the case. Everything was fine until the snow began to fall. It was slight at first. Then, within minutes, we could barely see a foot in front of the car. The snow battered the windshield relentlessly. Anne asked me if we should pull over and wait out the weather, but I told her not to worry. I had driven through worse storms before, and they'd usually pass within a few minutes of driving. Anne just gave me an unsure glance, but trusted my judgment. The storm wasn't letting up, but I was still adamant on continuing the trip. Anne turned to look at me, the same worried expression still on her face. She managed to give me a faint smile, and that's when it happened. I glanced over at her, and saw her face shift from a smile to a look of panic, as a pair of headlights attached to an 18-wheeler filled the windshield. An ear-splitting sound filled the car as glass shattered all around us. The sounds of rending metal and squealing tires filled the air. A sudden impact to my chest knocked me back in my seat as the car began to roll off the road into a nearby ditch. Our car came to a rest, upside down on a snowy bank. I could feel a trickle of warm blood run up my neck towards my face. I struggled to keep my eyes open. I couldn't look at anything aside from Anne hanging there in the seat next to me, motionless. I reached out to grab her hand, but before I could make it, I lost consciousness. The next thing I remember was the incessant buzzing of the hospital lights overhead, the rocking of the gurney as I was wheeled down hallways. I could feel pressure on my chest, and as my eyes drifted down, I saw a large chunk of metal sticking out of my body. The buzzing of the lights began to fade as a cacophony of urgent hospital sounds took its place. I remember asking where my girlfriend was, if she was all right. The nurses just told me to remain calm and to lie back. I was brought into the operating room and the lights overhead were blinding, even with my eyes shut. Although the doctors were muttering quietly amongst themselves, I heard one of them mention heart repair. Then, a shrill beep filled the room, and I passed out. I opened my eyes a moment later. I found myself standing in the operating room. looking at the masked doctors all around me. I asked them what had happened, but they didn't acknowledge me. That's when I noticed how slow all of the doctors were moving, as if time were almost standing still. I looked over the shoulder of one of the doctors and saw my face lying there on the table. I chuckled to myself as I finally realized what was happening. This whole entire situation looked like some cheesy scene in a medical TV show. That's when I felt a twinge of unease wash over me, and I felt like I was being watched. I looked around the room, trying to make sure I was alone. Then I saw it. There was a face sticking through one of the walls on the far side of the operating room. Its skin was white as bone. It had a very sharp chin and a pointed nose. Stringy white hair dangled down the sides of its face. Its eyes, however, were shut for some reason. I took a step back and watched as the rest of its body began to pass through the wall. 2 disturbingly long arms entered first. They reminded me of limbs of a spider. Bony hands with fingernail-like knives rested on the sterilized floor. They scraped across the floor as it pulled the rest of its body through. Its torso was thin, like this thing hadn't eaten in years. Its legs were the last to follow. 2 spindly appendages nearly as long as its arms stepped through the wall. By the time this thing was fully in the operating room, it was taking up half of it. It then dragged its body over to me, lying on the table, and hovered its face directly above mine. Its hands gripped the edges of the table, bending them slightly. Then, its mouth began to open. Teeth like an eel filled this thing's mouth. Rows and rows of thin, sharp needles. Its jaw began to dislocate and descend onto my unconscious face. Unsure of what to do, I shouted. The creature reeled back and turned its head towards me, its mouth closing in the process. Its eyes were still shut. The way it tilted its head as its attention was now fixed upon me instead of my body on the table was unsettling. It dragged one of its arms forward, and it landed right next to my feet. Then it pulled its body over to me. Before it could bring its face to mine, my instincts forced my legs to run. I ran through the hospital, down the stairs, and out of the exit. As I ran down the street, I noticed that the sky was empty and dark. There wasn't a single star in the sky. I slowed down and looked back to make sure whatever that thing wasn't following me anymore. But when I did, I ran into something and was knocked to the ground. Somehow, this thing had gotten in front of me. It loomed over my head. I tried to get up, but it rested its massive hand upon my chest, pinning me to the ground. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. My chest was getting tighter and tighter. The creature lowered its face inches away from mine. Then, it opened its eyes. Its eyes were black, with white dots all over it. They looked like the missing stars from the sky. My instincts were telling me not to look at them, but I couldn't look away. A mix of peace and fear, happiness and sorrow were overwhelming me. So much, in fact, that I almost didn't notice its teeth growing closer and closer to my face. Just before the needles entered my flesh, I opened my eyes and found myself lying in a hospital bed, sweat dripping from my body. Anne was sitting next to me holding my hand. She told me how worried she was and how glad she was that I was all right. Once I realized where I was, I tried to calm myself down. I asked her what had happened, and she explained the car accident to me. As she told me, flashbacks of seeing her body in the car filled my mind. I asked her if she was all right, and she said that the initial impact knocked her out. Because she was unconscious, her body didn't sustain as much damage as me. She told me that the guy driving the semi-truck was pretty banged up too, but he managed to remain conscious and called the police. She went on to tell me that a large piece of metal had punctured my chest, and that the doctors had to go in and surgically repair my heart. She told me they had to stop my heart for 6 minutes to fix it. Anne then commented on how pale I was, and asked me if everything was all right. I shook my head and I told her I was fine. The doctor entered, remarking on how pleased he was to see that I was awake. He stated that they wanted to keep me at the hospital for a few days, just to monitor me, but then he'd said I'd be free to go. I'm not sure if what I experienced that day was just a freak nightmare or some kind of hallucinogen brought on by the medication. But ever since that day, I see that face everywhere I go. Behind me in every mirror, peeking around every corner. I can't escape it. It's even worse when I sleep. Its face is directly in front of mine during the dream. Its eyes remained closed, and only when they start to open do I wake up. I have no idea if the thing I keep seeing is real or not. If it's not, then hopefully some medication can help me with the hallucinations. But if it is real, then I have a whole new reason to be afraid of death. And so do you.